All right, hey, we're back, and we're going to talk about sounder. Now I'm going to move my face over here, I think, this time, and I need to make it smaller. Actually, you know what? You don't need to see my face. Get out of here. It's not important. You don't need to see me. How vain am I? You want to see how to work Sounder. Okay, so this is Sounder. It is a podcast hosting provider. To sign up for it, you go to Sounder and you sign up. Now, I'm already signed in, so if I hit sign up, something weird will happen. But when you hit sign up, something else will happen and you'll sign up. I believe there is a free trial for the first 15 or so days. I might be wrong about that, but there is. Anyway, it's $12.99 a month. So that can be what you expect to spend for your podcast hosting. This is where your audio is hosted. I'm just going to sign in, and you're going to get to see something that I'm glad you're going to get to see because this is important. We get very obsessed about numbers, right? Now, today is September the 2nd, right? So we're 2 days into the month, and we can look at some of these podcasts. Now, this podcast hasn't even launched yet. I'm launching it with Jam Street Media, so it has no listens. This podcast, I haven't published anything for a week, so it has 5 listens. These two podcasts are podcasts I produce all the time. This is a daily, and this is a weekly. Now, this podcast is crazy popular. It's got 4,000 downloads just today. It's had 14,000. It's the second of the month, which is wild, right? Very popular podcast. But I bill myself not mainly as a philosopher, right, which is my most popular show. I'm Tanner Campbell. I'm Tanner Helps. I'm the podcast guy. Well, have a look at my Good Morning Podcasters. 131 downloads this month. What gives? Now, of course, podcasting for podcasters is a pretty niche podcast to create. But what I really want to drive home with this is that I'm a guy who's been doing this for 12 years at the time of recording. I feel a little old now. And I have a podcast that doesn't even get 100 downloads a day. And here I am, the expert. But then on the other hand, I have one over here that gets thousands a day. It's important, I think, not to beat yourself up about numbers. It depends on why you're podcasting. And something that I think we'll do at the end of this course is talk about paid advertising on inside of apps like Overcast or Fountain or Podcast Addict or Player FM. We'll talk about how you can spend a little bit of money every month and get regular growth. But growing a podcast is hard, okay? You're not going to get. This is a phenomenon. Like, I don't even understand how this is happening. I've never marketed this podcast a single day in my life. And yet here it is, 200,000, 300,000 downloads a month. It's insane. This one, do every day. Put a lot more work into. Not even 100 downloads a day. So numbers are weird. Don't expect things not to take off. That would be cool. It happens, as you can see. But expect that you put in a lot of work and it takes a long time to grow. I just wanted to say that very quickly because, a lot of people out there will, promise you 100,000 downloads in your first month. Be careful about people who say things like that because it's really not easy. And if they could really do that, well, they wouldn't be teaching you how to do it. They'd be retired on an island somewhere probably. So this is the screen you're going to see, maybe. But you're going to come up here and click Add New Podcast. So I'm going to click that. Now, you could import a podcast from another host if you already had one, but this is your first podcast, so you don't have one. We're going to create a podcast. So let's create. Now, we don't have any artwork. We haven't gone over artwork, and I'm not going to go over artwork with you. It's up to you to create your own artwork. Maybe I'll mention places you can get it. In fact, I'll link some things in maybe this video in the courseware down below, places where you can get artwork done for an affordable price, probably going to be Fiverr, or how you could do it in Canva even yourself if you're comfortable doing that. So I'll just upload. I'll upload. Oh, Maddie's going to be pissed at me for this, but Maddie is the CEO of Jam Street Media, and when we were at Podfest in Orlando earlier this year, we went to a gator farm in Orlando, and he got on top of a gator. It was very funny. So I'm going to use this picture because I think if he ever finds out I've used it, he'll get a good giggle out of it. So we'll call this what do we call it again? The Pretend Fantasy podcast. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you don't put podcast in your podcast title. So I'm not going to do that. It's a podcast. It's like you don't put album on the name of your record album, right? It's not, although the White Album, I guess, in some cases. If you're the Beatles, you can make your own rules. But in most cases, you don't put podcast in your title. People know it's a podcast, okay? It's going to automatically generate a podcast page URL. So this is something that Sounder provides for you at no cost. It's just, whatever you want it to be. I'm going to have it be Pretend Fantasy, but you could change this to PF for Pretend Fantasy, and it actually happens to be available, so I could use that. But I'm just going to let it use Pretend Fantasy as it was before, and I'll just leave it at pretendfantasy.sounder.fm. Now we want a podcast description. It's important to remember when when someone is searching for a podcast, they are not searching for your clever name. They are searching for what the podcast is. You might have noticed on the previous screen, which I will not go back to, the name of one of the podcasts was The Dictionary of Mythology and Folklore. And the other one was, what is the other one? The one that we're coming out with is Mythology and Folklore with Tanner and Eric. And you'll notice that the really popular one, the Stoicism podcast, was Practical Stoicism. Now, I don't think anybody's going to search for the Dictionary of Mythology and Folklore, and I don't think anybody's going to search for Practical Stoicism, but I do think 100% that people are going to search for the words that are in that title: mythology podcast, folklore podcast, stoicism podcast, right? So I think it's important that when you title your podcast, which I went over in a previous video, and when you describe your podcast in your description, that you're keeping in mind how people look for things. And I'm not telling you to keyword stuff, but I'm telling you to balance writing for a human and writing for a search algorithm. So I'm going to say the Pretend Fantasy podcast is a bi-weekly program bringing you the best in fantasy stories. It's painful to watch me type this, I'm sure. The best in fantasy stories and the most obscure of pretending. I don't know. Maybe people are searching for these things. Right? This is a ridiculous name that I've chosen to go with this in this demo, but people are going to search for, in this example, I suppose, fantasy podcast. Well, I've got fantasy here mentioned twice, okay? Maybe they're going to search for stories podcast. So I've got the word stories in here. Maybe they're going to search for pretend or pretending. So I'm using these keywords in my description. I'm using them thoughtfully. Well, I mean, not here, not very thoughtfully, but I would be if this was a serious podcast, and you should too. I'm not going to bore you with trying to write something really great here, but this should be probably 3 sentences long, a nice short paragraph, maybe something like that, something that ends up being, this long, and that's enough. This doesn't need to be an insane, this doesn't need to be an autobiography, okay? So a paragraph or so, something like this, or maybe even this is okay. You could even put in something like, hosted by your names, because people might search for your podcast by your name if they know you have one but don't know what it's called, or by your brand. So you could say also by Tanner Campbell, and published and recorded at the Tanner Campbell Studios in Denver, Colorado. That's probably okay. Now we have the podcast category. This is incredibly important. There are parent categories and there are child categories. So top level and sub-level categories. It is best, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, to select subcategories for your categories. So mine is probably going to be storytelling books. So I'll select books. I'll select another option because I want to appear in more than one category. Let's say education, self-improvement, fiction. Sure, fiction, maybe, but I don't have a really good one there. I'll say drama, short fiction drama. And I can add those 2 categories. Some people might say arts and then arts books, but I don't like that. I'm going to select arts books, which I already have down here. And maybe there's a better one in here. Kids and family, education for kids, parenting, stories for kids. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So I've got 2 subcategories as my categories. Podcast author, well, that could be you or it could be your brand or your company, whatever makes sense. There's no wrong answer here. Language spoken in the podcast, whatever it is, in my case, English. Podcast owner email. Now, this is important. This is podcasts are delivered via RSS, which we'll talk about in a bit. But RSS files, or a type of XML document, are public. So whatever email you put here, people will be able to see. And I promise you that you will get a bunch of podcast-related spam too when you first launch. So it might be a good idea for you to sign up for a free Gmail account, fantasypodcast@gmail.com, whatever it is, and use that here. Now, that doesn't have to be the email that you tell people to email you when you speak your email on your show, but this will prevent your main primary work inbox, if you're creating for work. You could have your IT guys set up like podcast@company.com and put that here, so it's not like your CEO's email address, because he or she will get very pissed after about his or her 600th podcast marketing email. So keep that in mind and act accordingly. I'll leave this here. Your time zone is important because every option you get as far as time is concerned on this back end when uploading episodes is going to it's going to be reflective of your time zone. So choose the right one. For me, that's U.S. Mountain Time, if I can find the darn thing. There we go. Enable monetization. Now, this is great, but we're going to turn it off. We're not going to start with monetization because that'll make things weird for us right off the bat, and we don't want that. One of the things that Sounder does is one-button ads that you can just put into your show and start making money. It's not a lot of money. The programmatic stuff is actually a fairly low CPM, but it's some money, and that's nice. But we're going to have it off for when we start. By default, Sounder will publish your podcast. Now, all that means in this case is that it's going to publish the Sounder podcast website that we talked about when we were filling out this section here. So we'll go ahead and leave that on. It's okay to publish this. Nobody knows it exists, right? You can do it this week, even if you don't plan to launch for months. Nobody is ever going to find this page unless you tell them about it. There are more options here. Does it contain explicit content? By the way, if you missed that, I hit more options. I expanded this. Is it explicit? If it is explicit, and by that I don't mean you say damn or shit on occasion. I mean that because you can mark those episodes individually as being uniquely explicit, among episodes that are usually not. But if the show is explicit, you want to mark it that way. Because if you don't mark it that way and somebody complains that it should be marked that way, there is a chance that you could get deplatformed from Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and you don't want that. So if it's explicit and you know if it is or not, then check it. If you have to ask, check it just in case. And all this does is it puts a little warning that says like adult content, like you would see on old records that you would buy, right? This is a parental advisory kind of thing. So you'd say yes or no, and then I'm going to say no, and it's going to say, it's going to ask you what kind of format is this in? Is it episodic? This is the default podcast type that sorts episodes from oldest to newest, recommended for standalone podcasts that listeners can hear in any order. This is a little misleading. I'll come back to it in a second. Episodic serial sorts episodes from newest to oldest grouped by season, recommended for podcasts that have multiple seasons that listeners can hear in any order. Serial sorts episodes from oldest to newest, grouped by season with the most recent on top. Recommended for podcasts that have multiple seasons that should be listened to in chronological order. Now I'm going to scroll up here so that I don't tell you something wrong, and I'm going to open up a new tab. And I'm going to go to my Stoicism podcast. I'm going to see what this is set up as, because those suggestions don't read the way that I would expect them to read. So let me go to, where do I do this here? Edit podcast. And I want to see what I have selected here. I have episodic. Now if I open up Practical Stoicism on Apple Podcasts, should be able to find it pretty easy. There it is. It's going to try to launch the app now, which I've always found an annoying thing. This is in Spanish. My podcast is not in Spanish, so let's change this from, actually this might be PT, this might be Portuguese. Let's change that to EN, I think is English. So the most recent is on top, which is not exactly what this makes it sound like. This is the default where newest to oldest. Oh, yeah, I guess that's right. Yeah, that's right. We want episodic. Man, I just took you on a... Maybe I'll cut that out. No, I'll leave it. We all make mistakes. Episodic is what you want, is what most of you want, unless it matters that people start with episode 1 and then progress, in which case it would be episodic. It would be serial or episodic serial. But most podcasts are episodic in that it really doesn't matter if they've listened to your back catalog. They can jump in at any point. They can jump into the latest episode and everything's fine. Podcast owner name. So defaults to the podcast author, which we filled out earlier up there in the form. But it may be different, a different individual or company. So, for example, I am the author of this podcast, but if I was owned by a studio, maybe that's the owner. So you, as a worker at a company, you could be the author, the creator of the podcast, but the owner might be your brand. You'll sort that out. For most people, the author and the owner are the same, and it's usually a person's name. And then copyright 2022, probably whatever you put here. RSS feed keywords. This is not a bad idea. You're a business podcast. Business podcast. Tab or comma, probably, or plus. There we go. That's not what this is, but you could say business podcast, CEO mindset. You could create keywords that you think people might search for, and those will be embedded in your RSS feed. I actually don't use this feature. I probably should, but I would encourage you to. Don't keyword stuff here. Maybe just do 3 to 5 keywords. And remember, keywords are things you think people will actually search for. So business podcast, for a business podcast, probably a good one. Steve's business podcast, probably not a good key phrase. And keywords, this could be a little misleading. Keywords can be multiple words. It should really say keywords and key phrases. So it doesn't have to be one word. It can be, like I said before, business podcast. And then you hit the plus sign, you can add another one. And hit the X to get rid of it. I won't put anything there, and now we'll click save. Successfully updated. My goodness, I'm still in. I forgot I did that. I got to go back here and click save. Thank goodness I didn't make any actual changes to that podcast. That would have been just so sad for me. Okay, congratulations. You have created a podcast. It's Pretend Fantasy by Tanner Campbell. Add your first episode to this podcast. I'm going to do this later. Let's explore a little bit. Let's look at our podcast webpage. Cool. This is our podcast webpage. It would have the most recent episode here and a bunch of other episodes down here and some information about how to subscribe to my podcast, like on Spotify, which of course it doesn't actually exist there because we haven't distributed it there, and anywhere else we would put it. The Pretend Fantasy is a bi-weekly program bringing you the best in fantasy stories. What a piece of copy that is. And look at Maddie. That alligator actually peed on his shoe during that shot, which was the best part of it for me, and the least good part of it for him. Now, if you have Pro, which I believe is now, they used to have a free tier, but I believe is the only tier of sounder you can have, is you can go to Customize, and you can make some changes to this website to more so match your colors or your brand or whatever you have. So you can customize the web player, which for some reason I can't do because I have no episode that I've uploaded, but I can customize the web page a little bit. We can change the primary button color. Maybe I want that to be burgundy. That looks like burgundy. And the secondary color, which is kind of this background color, maybe I want that to be like this light pink color. Sure, that looks good. Do I want the sounder branding on or off? Well, if you're a pro user, you can turn it off and you can get rid of this banner. You can leave it on if you want to help promote Sounder. Advertising as well, if you're using Sounder Plus, instead of having ads present on your website that you're not getting paid for, you can turn that off so that you don't have those ads. And then you can save this. And you can preview what this looks like on a tablet and what it looks like on a mobile device. So you can get a sense of what your design looks like across various places to look at where people might see it. Now, again, nobody knows this page exists, right? It's public. We're about to publish an episode. We're about to publish our trailer, but don't worry. No one knows this exists. The next thing we're going to do is go to distribute, and we're going to see that Spotify is connected. Now, when we hit launch, it is going to launch our show on Spotify. It's going to be here. It's going to take a while to get there. It takes a few hours. But don't worry. Nobody knows it exists. No one's going to find it. And we actually have to do this soft launch with our trailer before we do our formal launch, because it can take a few days in order for a podcast to actually show up on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify and all these other places that you have to submit it. We're not there yet. That's what we're going to do in the last week. We're going to submit everything. But if we do this now, it means we can really tightly control launch day, because technically we're launching now, but nobody knows about it. We're not promoting it. So don't flip out that your podcast is going to be live within an hour on Spotify. Nobody knows it exists. It's okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to dashboard. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to go to manage that podcast. And we're going to add a new episode for this podcast. Upload. We're going to find wherever in the world I put that file, Pretend Fantasy Podcast MP3. We're uploading it, and it's just introducing podcast. What is it called? Pretend Fantasy Podcast. That's the trailer. Now you can put whatever you want here. This is the podcast trailer. But you actually want to put some work into this. I'm going to go through it quickly. You can change the name that it gives the URL for your episode. I usually don't, but you can if you want. We put our show notes in here. This is our show notes. Episode type. Well, this is not a full episode, and it's not episode 1. It is a trailer. And we're going to remove that number because it's not episode 1. It's episode nothing. And then we'll go down here, and we have right here post-roll and pre-roll enabled. Well, we don't want that, because if we do that, it's going to put ads in this audio. Nope. And for right now, make this preference the default for all future episodes so we don't have to remember that. Then we can slide past monetization. We can look at more options, and we can create an episode summary. We can add some keywords here for the episode. I'm not going to do that, but I would encourage you to do that because I don't want to take up more time. Where does the episode link to? This is the episode link that exists in the RSS feed. Do we want it to link to the episode page, to the podcast webpage, to somewhere else, or to a full screen sounder player? I usually say episode page. And publish options now, or you can schedule it for later. So we've got everything we want here. I'm going to go ahead and hit publish now. You've successfully published your episode. Cool. So now, if I copy this link and I paste it, where if I just refresh this page, I will see the changes I made to the design, and I can see my episode. And if I hit play, I'll be taken to this page.
Everyone says.
And there's actually an ad in this because I just turned that off, and it takes a minute for that to actually update. But we've turned it off so there wouldn't be an ad. But there's an ad immediately. This is one of the good things about Sounders, that when you're ready, you can just turn on programmatic ads and start making money. So it's a cool feature. But here's our episode. It's going to play the ad, so I'm not going to do that. But there's our episode. We could play it. We could listen to it. And now that we've done this, we can go back to manage episodes, manage podcasts, customize, and now we can customize this player because we've got an episode in there. Customize Sounder player. We can choose some default themes, midnight blue, black, and white, or we can customize our own stuff. I could select what I had, kind of a burgundy color, right? Something like this. So it matches the color I chose on the web page. Secondary color is white, so let's see where that secondary color comes in. We'll make it blue so it's really obvious, or purple, so we can see that that's right in the middle. So maybe we'll keep that like kind of an off-white, like that. And then our next color is our accent color, which we can see is up here on some of these buttons like the closed captioning. So we'll change that maybe to white. And then we'll hit save. And our player color is saved, and if we come back to the website and we refresh, we should see that updated here. Very cool. So now we've got some kind of branding on the page that looks decent. Now, whether or not you go off and create a real website for your podcast, that's up to you. This is not a website design course, but this is how you can start. And there are other places like like Podsites or podpage.com that can help you make websites. For example, my podcast, stoicismpod.com, is built on Podpage, so I don't really do much. I just set it up once, and I get this a little bit more of an attractive website that's got some subscribe options and a way to contact me and a list of episodes and a blog and a way to look at reviews. Like, that's pretty cool. Somebody left me a 4-star. Darn that guy. No, I'm just kidding. I'm grateful. So that's the webpage, and that's the customization that you can do. Now, what other things should we do? Well, let's go through some of the things here. If we go to Manage, we're going to get to Edit Podcast webpage. Well, this is where we would edit any of the details we created when we set up the podcast itself, and this is where we would edit the colors and things for the podcast webpage. If we want to copy our RSS feed, we would do that here, just by clicking it, and now all of a sudden it is on our dashboard, just like that. We can also manage episodes here. Share, transcribe, analytics, monetize. Transcribe. Well, that's interesting. One of the other cool things about Sounder is that it automatically transcribes your audio within a minute or 3 of uploading it. So I can actually come right here. Oh, it used to do it automatically. Maybe it doesn't do it automatically anymore, but I can hit transcribe. Oh, it does seem to actually already be done. There we go. And there's my transcription. And I can just copy this transcription and paste it into a blog if I wanted to, or I could download the audio file and put it wherever I want. A cool thing about their player is that you can actually search through the audio based on words and advance the playhead that way. The embeddable player is pretty cool. If something's wrong in the transcript, you can also edit it. It thinks Pretendsville is a geopolitical entity, which I find absolutely hysterical, and I'm going to leave it because I want them to think that. But you can edit November 1st. You can expect episodes, once they start releasing, to release every other. There you go. So there's a transcript editor too, in case it doesn't get things right. Now, if you're not someone who enunciates very clearly, or maybe there's just some crosstalk, or maybe there's a word that's a proper noun and it has no idea how to spell it, it's probably going to get it wrong. But what I should say is that the automatic transcription in Sounder is good enough that I never touch it, because I know that it's good enough for SEO purposes. So I never go in and correct it. But you might be the person who would want to. And then you could look at episode-specific analytics, which of course we won't have yet for this, and you can look at the monetization options for it. We are going to turn these off. I thought I did turn these off. There we go. So now those ads are gone. We've got distribute. So this is how we distribute our podcast to all these platforms. Now, this is going to be a video unto itself because I have a feeling this one's already getting too long. That'll be maybe the next video. Then we have share. So we have ways to share our player, to embed our player on a website, to make a video of our episodes. Customize takes us into those customization options. SEO allows us to create some SEO around the website, around the podcast, which you should take the time to do. This is not an SEO course, but you should be spending time to fill these out. If you have Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, Facebook Pixels for advertising, let's say you're a corporate podcaster, you can paste those tracking codes here, and you should if you have them. Then there's apps. So there are some plugins that you can use. Sounder transcription, it's enabled. Chartable, proxy integrations. We're not going to go into these things. These things are a little advanced, so we're not going to do that. Design, explore these. See how these things will integrate with your upload and publishing process to make your life easier. You can see here, record remote interviews that look and sound great. It looks like you can bring maybe your files directly in from Riverside right to here. Maybe. I don't know. I've never explored that. But definitely thumb through these and see if any of them can help you. Analytics are where you find your analytics for your whole show, if you're not looking at a specific episode. Now, of course, here there's not much use, so let me go to Dashboard and we'll open up Practical Stoicism and we'll look at analytics here. And we'll change it to last month since we're only on the second day of this month. August. There we go. And then go. And we can see what episodes did what, where they were downloaded from, what applications were used to download them. You can see that most of my audience is on Spotify. What devices? Phone, more than anything else, almost none for these comparatively. What browsers were used when people listened, if they were listening in their browser. What time of day seems to be the most popular to listen to an episode? Seems to be right around here for me for whatever reason. Countries that they come from. Click on the United States. And now I can get, I zoomed out there. Didn't mean to do that. See what states they're in. The darker the color, the more listeners are in that area. Get a little breakdown here. Ad impressions if I were running ads. I don't have any ads running on that show in particular. And where the streams came from, referral traffic, charts, all kinds of cool stuff for you to figure out more about who's listening and where they're coming from. Pretty rad, right? A lot of data here. You can also set up email reports so that you don't have to jump in and look at this data. You can just say, hey, every 7 days, just send me a file that tells me all about this so that I don't have to go in here and look at these analytics and do the math that way. I can just get a little message to my inbox and load it into Excel and look at it that way. So that's something you might want to set up. Now, monetize, we're not going to go over this. This is something I would suggest. This is something that I would suggest you do. This is something I would suggest you have a conversation with Sounder about when you're ready. Reach out to them, use this little chat bubble down here, have a talk with them, and say, hey, I'd like to turn on ads. You think I'm ready? You want to help me out with it? And they will. They're very customer service forward. And then, of course, you can always save a little money if you pay for the whole thing up front. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about uploading your audio. In the next video, we're going to talk about taking your RSS feed and actually soft launching this podcast with nothing but your trailer so that it's ready to go when you're ready to go and you have your episodes. So that'll be up next.